Who here wants to be happy? Yes? You like to be happy? Yeah? We all want to be happy, right? And there are many things that make us happy, but there are not many things that make us happy in the deepest sense of the word happy. When we think about what can provide us a happiness that never ceases, right? There are many things that make us happy, and then, they pass away, and, it was enjoyable for the time. But what is the key to true happiness? What is the key to a happiness that really lasts? And yeah, there's some good answers. And as I was studying this morning, I said, there are some different answers, I guess you could give, but actually they're all connected. And what I'm going to share this morning focuses on one aspect that's actually connected to all the answers we might give. So it was mentioned God. We sang in the song, "'Tis love that makes us happy." But I want to dig into that a little deeper and see and help us understand. And I want to share with you from a little bit of my own experience as well, what is the key to true happiness? In Proverbs chapter 29, verse 18, we read here that where there is no vision, the people perish, but he that keepeth the law, happy is he. That seems a little strange. Who here feels happy when they're presented with laws? Who here feels happy when you're presented with, a new law in your neighborhood about what you can and can't do and this and that? And who here feels happy when they're presented with a law that says you must drive at this speed limit? Who feels happy when you find out there's a law that says that you have to give this much of your money to the government, right? Pay your taxes. Laws don't always make us feel happy. Would you agree? We usually think of law. We don't think that's related at all to happiness. It seems like something that actually stops happiness in its tracks. But we're not just talking about any law here. We're talking about the law. And in the context of Proverbs here, we're talking about the law of God. He that keepeth the law of God, happy is he. And why is that? Because the law of God is based on different principles than most of the laws in this world. What is the principle of the law of God, and how does this relate to happiness? Because it says here, he that keepeth the law, happy is he. In Matthew 22, 37 to 40, Jesus said here, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the what? The law and the prophets." So Jesus said here, the principle of the law, the summary of the law, is that you shall love God, all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. So the law is a reflection of God's character of love, that perfect agape, selfless love, right? And what we see here is that Jesus says that the law is summarized in a reflection of that love. The way to reflect that love, living in harmony with that love, is to love God with all your heart and to love others as yourself. And so what we see then is that if we connect this to Proverbs chapter 29, keeping the law, loving God, and loving others is what leads to true happiness. If we understand the law in that sense, not restrictions, but actually loving God, loving others, this is the secret to happiness. But what does agape love look like practically, and how can we summarize it? Well, 1 Corinthians chapter 13 says that love, among other things, is not self-seeking. So if the law is based on the principle of love, and love is not self-seeking, and the law is what makes us happy, then what we begin to discover here is that true happiness can only be found when we live a life that is not entirely devoted to what? Self-seeking. True happiness can only be found when we seek to love and to benefit and to bless others. Agape love is the opposite of self-seeking. It is the opposite of self-centered. It is other-centered. It is focused outward instead of inward. And so according to these few verses we've seen here, that the key to happiness, based on what we've read in Proverbs, especially starting as our starting point there, the key to happiness is not to live a life where I try and please myself. We've said there are many things that make us happy, but there's sort of a temporary happiness. But what is the key to true happiness? To live a life where we serve God, but we also serve others. And by serving others, we serve God. This is the example that Jesus gave us in the early years of his life. In Luke 2:52, it says that Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. Now, when it says here he increased in favor, in grace, in harmony with God and men, what this tells us is that Jesus lived in harmony and he lived graciously and lovingly towards God and towards others around him. And this shouldn't surprise us. This verse shouldn't be that complicated when we understand the two great principles of the law, and when we understand that Jesus was the perfect embodiment of the law and that Jesus kept the law perfectly. It would make sense to us that at all times and in all places throughout his life, Jesus lived for the benefit of others, and he lived to serve God and to serve his fellow men. Not only for the 3.5 years of his public ministry, but all through his life, because this here in Luke 2 is especially talking about his early years. And commenting on this beautiful sentence, Desire of Ages, page 70, says, from his earliest years, he, talking about Jesus, was possessed of one purpose. He lived to bless others. We think about many things when we think about what it means to follow the example of Jesus. When someone says, are you following the example of Jesus? Are you following Jesus? Are you a Christian? Are you living like Jesus? We think of all of these things, okay, which are not wrong, but we have, sometimes it can be a little bit hard to figure out what is the essence of that? How do you best summarize that? What does it mean to live like Jesus? Would you agree that you think of many things, right? You think about this and that, and you go, okay, but how can I break it down into a very basic principle that can guide me in my life? I think the best way it can be summarized, yes, to live like Jesus means many things, but I think that they all can be summarized in this. He lived to bless others. And not only did he do this, but it says that it not only happened occasionally, it was not only something that happened during his public ministry, but it happened from his earliest years, right, as a child. And it says that he not only had this desire, not only had this experience, the majority of the time, but it says that he was actually possessed of that purpose, of that one purpose. When somebody is possessed of one purpose, there is nothing that can take them away from that. There is nothing that can distract them. There is nothing that can cause them to lose their focus, right? To be possessed of a purpose, we think about the word possessed, it almost signifies you're under the control of a power that forces you in that direction, right? There's obviously possession of an evil spirit, right? You understand what I'm saying? There's evil spirits and someone's possessed, they're under the control of that power. But if you are possessed of a good purpose, in the same way, there's a power that is driving you that you cannot be taken another way. When someone's possessed of an evil spirit, they cannot do what they want, right? They're wholly in that direction. But in the good sense, in the positive sense, to be possessed of one purpose, you are unable to be moved from that goal, from that object, from that reality, which in the case of Jesus was that he lived to bless others. And this is really keeping the law. This is living in harmony with love, right? Love is focused on others. Jesus lived to bless others. And according to Proverbs 29:18, he that keeps the law, he that lives in love to God and lives in love to others, he that lives to bless others, happy is he. True happiness is found in service to others. have we found the key to happiness ourselves? Have we made it the purpose of our lives to live to bless others? Not occasionally, not every now and then, not, once a week. Have we made it the purpose of our lives, not only through, we think about service to others, we think, okay, missionary work, preaching, teaching. Not only that, everything you do, whether it's with your family at home, your parents, your children, your wife, your husband, your grandparents, your parents, all, whatever it is, whether it's with your co-workers, your neighbors, your relatives, okay? To be out in the field farming with a co-worker, and you can still be possessed of the purpose to live to bless others. There's no time at the moment to talk about the gospel. Something's going wrong. He's in a very hard labor. He needs a lot. And you can just be possessed to bless others at that moment. In another moment, there will be a chance to share the gospel. But just thinking about this, I don't want us to narrow it down to only preaching and teaching and sharing spiritual things, which is obviously the main goal. But there are things that bring us into the position where people can see that we love them and care for them and bring us to that point. But do we live to bless others? Is that the purpose of our lives? And if the answer maybe is no, I don't know what it is for you, but if the answer is no, could this be the reason why we fail to find true happiness and why we find that many times we're unhappy even when we think that we have many of the things that we thought would make us happy. Or we're doing the things, or we're living in the way that we thought would make us happy, and yet we're finding that it's not a lasting happiness. Could it be because we have missed our purpose, the only thing that can make us happy, which is living according to God's law, living, following God, and God Himself, but actually living not to please ourselves, but to bless others. The disciples had this problem. The disciples were no different to you and me. The disciples wanted happiness. They wanted fulfillment. They wanted joy. They wanted satisfaction. And they thought that this could be found in positions of authority, in positions of recognition, in self-seeking, self-serving. They thought this would give them the ultimate sense of happiness. This is what they wanted. And so on one occasion, if you remember the story in Matthew 20, two of Jesus' disciples came and asked Jesus for the highest positions in His kingdom. They believed that this is what would give them the greatest fulfillment. But the response of Jesus here was not only a rebuke to their pride and their selfishness, but actually an example that would help them to understand what His purpose was and what led to true fulfillment in life. And Jesus says here in Matthew 20, verses 25 to 28, He called them to Himself and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who are great exercise authority over them." So He says, the Gentiles have this position of being over people, right? The people exist for my benefit. I lord it over them. They serve me. Do you understand? He says that's the way in which the Gentiles operate. They exercise authority over. They lord it over. He says, "Yet it shall not be so among you, but whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your servant. And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give His life a ransom for many." Jesus showed the disciples that contrary to what they thought, both in His example and His teaching, the greatest sense of purpose and happiness and fulfillment would come when they learned, like Him, not to be served, but to serve others. As I said, they thought that the greatest fulfillment, the greatest happiness, the greatest joy would come if they could have authority over others, if they could have something that would satisfy self and the desire for recognition and authority and all of the other things that came along with that. Jesus said, It is different in the kingdom of heaven. If you want to be first, if you want to have the greatest fulfillment, if you want to have the greatest sense of joy, if you want to have the greatest sense of, power, true power, learn to serve. Learn to put others before yourself. Learn to live to bless others. And as he neared the end of his ministry, he again reminded the disciples of the key to true happiness, because Jesus knew that they were not happy. While they were jostling for self-serving, while they were trying to obtain fulfillment and happiness by getting the highest position, by being the one that was over the others, they were not happy. And they were many times ashamed to even walk close to Jesus. They would trail off from him because they were having these discussions. And they were not happy. They were not at peace. True happiness goes along. We're not talking specifically about peace today, but true happiness and joy goes along with true peace, right? Inner peace. And they had none of these things because they were wrestling and contending for self-seeking. They couldn't be happy. Again, going back to Proverbs, they couldn't be happy because they were not keeping the law. The law is the principle of serving others. They were serving themselves and they could not find happiness. They were not content, they were not at peace, they were not happy. And so Jesus gives them an illustration again of what his purpose was, what his ministry was about, and what would lead to their ultimate happiness. In John chapter 13, verses 12 to 16, it says that Jesus washed their feet. The foot washing was not only an act of it was not only a ceremony that was to be established for the set time of the Lord's Supper. It was an act that had a meaning that extended far beyond the upper room. It was to guide and direct their lives. It was to be a principle by which they lived. That they were to place themselves in the lowest position, as Jesus had given them example, and that they were to always seek to serve and to bless others. And then Jesus made it very clear that they were not only to do this because this was just, obedience to him, just because this is what would, help to save them for the kingdom of heaven. He didn't just tell them, just do this because I'm telling you to do this, humble yourselves. But he then went on and said, know ye what I have done to you. You call me Master and Lord, and ye say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, ye also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that ye should do as I have done to you. This was, notice, an example, not a ceremony. They were to think about the lessons that were to be learned from this. And then in verse 17 he says, verily, verily, I say unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord, neither he that is sent greater than he that sent him. And then in verse 17 he brings it home and says, if you know these things, happy are ye if ye do them. Do you think Jesus was trying to tell the disciples that they would be happy if once every couple of months they participated in a foot washing service there just before a communion service? Do you think that's what Jesus was telling them? Come along to this service, make sure you wash each other's feet, and you will be happy. Was Jesus limiting it to this act of service? No. The principle that was to guide their life was one of humility and one of service. They were to seek to bless others, to bless each other, to serve others, to serve each other whenever they had an opportunity. And Jesus knew that only when they came to this point could they find true happiness. They could find true peace. They would no longer be fighting and wrestling and struggling for the highest place. They would be happy. They would find true joy, true happiness. The same is true for us. True happiness can only come from living a life of unselfish service, where we seek to bless others wherever we find opportunity. Again, this is repeated by Jesus after the Last Supper in John 15, verses 9 to 10, where he says, "As the Father hath loved me, so have I loved you. Continue ye in my love. If ye keep my commandments, ye shall abide in my love, and even as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love." So Jesus says here, continue in my love. What was the practical manifestation of the love of Jesus? It was service and blessing to others. Okay, it wasn't just words. It wasn't just, a profession of love. It was manifested in service and practical blessing to others. And then he goes on and says in verse 11, these things, I'm telling you to continue in my love, continue in my commandments, right, which are based on the principle of love. He says, these things I've spoken unto you, that my joy might remain in you, and that your joy might be full. Two things Jesus says here. First of all, he says, the joy that I have, which comes from keeping my Father's commandments, living in harmony with love, serving others, that joy, I want it to remain in you. I want you to have a happiness that is permanent, a happiness that is lasting. Not a happiness that comes and goes based on the circumstances, but a happiness that lasts, and not only is lasting in its quantity, in its quantity, but is full in its quality, that is of the highest sense. In other words, what Jesus is saying here, he says, if you want to have true happiness of the highest sense, not only every now and then, but for a lasting period of time, if you want to have a happiness and joy that remains with you, and if you want to have it in the highest degree, these things I have spoken unto you. And then he goes down and just brings it home again in verse 12. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. We talk about love and we sometimes make it very theoretical, but what is practical love? Service to others. I remember when I was growing up, we used to sing a song and we used to write it up on the board at camp meetings. Joy. What is the secret to true joy? Now, it's probably only going to make sense in English, sorry. But joy is Jesus first, and yourself last, and others in between. J for Jesus, O for others, Y for you, for yourself. True joy must be Jesus first, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. Others second, love your neighbor as yourself, and yourself last. Does that make sense? Remember when I was a kid, that's what we learned. The secret to joy is, and we put it in that way, the song would go, Jesus first, and yourself last, and others in between. The true happiness, the true joy that God wants to give us can only come when we live a life of loving service to others. In Testimonies for the Church, Volume 9, page 42, we read that those who give their lives to Christ-like ministry know the meaning of true happiness. When we think about Christ-like ministry, sometimes, now, we need more people to dedicate their lives to the preaching of the gospel. There's no doubt. Full-time evangelism. There's no doubt about that. But when we think about Christ-like ministry, it encompasses far more than this. Because the majority of Jesus' earthly life was not spent publicly preaching and teaching the gospel. The majority of Jesus' life was spent in a town that was known for its wickedness, that was known for being one of the worst towns in that place, working not among the high nobility of society and the, whether the marketplaces, the legislative halls, the centers of business, but working in a carpenter's shop. And for almost 30 years, besides the time that he was very young, but, for the majority of his life, Jesus lived in these circumstances, carrying out these daily duties, and yet the whole time being possessed of one purpose: to live to bless others. If you read the Desire of Ages, I believe it's in the Desire of Ages, it may be elsewhere also, but we never think about that. Why did Jesus, wouldn't it have been better for Jesus to grow up in a place different to Nazareth? But it was brought out, and I don't have the reference, but it's brought out a very interesting point, and that is that if Jesus' surroundings were better than the surroundings that some of us have had or do have or maybe will have in the future, especially children, youth, but if Jesus had these surroundings far better than many people get to experience, the excuse would be made, well, I am only a product of my environment. Yes, I can be like Jesus, but look where Jesus grew up. Beautiful home surroundings, beautiful city, not much wickedness, right? But the fact that Jesus could grow up in a place that was proverbial for wickedness, Nazareth, and yet live a life free from sin and wholly focused and dedicated to serving and blessing others, shows us, and also a life of poverty too, right? Not a life of wealth, but a life of poverty. And a life in the honest, hard work of the trade of a carpenter, right? Shows us that to live a life of Christ-like ministry applies to every aspect of our lives. Every single person here can go from this place, and as the new week starts, and as you return to your place of school or work or home, wherever you are, every person can give their life to Christ-like ministry and experience true happiness. And then, if the time comes, as it did in the life of Jesus, where the Lord calls us to leave that behind, like He called the disciples as well, to leave that behind and enter into full-time evangelism and full-time dedication to spreading the gospel, then we continue the life of ministry. But to live a life of Christ-like ministry is simply to keep that aim ever in mind, that I am here to bless and to serve others. Can you imagine? Can you imagine Jesus there in the carpenter's shop and I don't know, but imagine people come with the work that they need done, and maybe they've come a long way, maybe it's an urgent need, maybe it's late at night, and can you just imagine Jesus missing meals, up late at night, no complaints, not charging them more money, right, to try and rip them off, just saying, you know what, this is ministry. This person's in need. And doing the best, right? Doing the best at everything that He did. This is just one example. You read Desire of Ages, right? Talks about, on his way to the carpenter's shop or at lunchtime, finding other children that didn't have lunch and often going without food so that they could eat. It goes so much deeper than we often think about. We so much focused on the life of Jesus at His baptism and from that point forward. But He lived a life of blessing to others from His earliest years in the most difficult of circumstances, right? Poverty, wickedness, and also a difficult family situation, right, as well, with the sons of Joseph. A lot of jealousy, perhaps, or they're feeling rebuked, right? Jealousy, and trying to discourage him, and yet he gave his life to ministry, to serving others, and that was something that enabled him to have a joy that was full and a joy that remained, and nothing could take that happiness away from him. And this is the same. Those that dedicate their lives, give their lives to Christ-like ministry, they know the meaning of true happiness. Have you dedicated your life to ministry, to service? Whether it's in the carpenter's shop or in the office building, in the school, in the home, wherever it is. Counsels on Stewardship says here, seeking the good of others is the way in which true happiness can be found. Do you want to find true happiness? Seek the good of others. It says, man does not work against his own interest by loving God and his fellow men. The more unselfish his spirit, the happier he is. Why? Because he is fulfilling God's purpose for him. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but as a rhetorical question, have you sometimes wondered what your purpose is in life? You sometimes wondered, what is my purpose? You know, there are a lot of people who have good jobs. They have, good homes. They have, their families are healthy. They have many things. But they are still failing to find what their purpose is in life. And for that reason, they can work hard, they can get awards, they can be promoted, they can be clapped and praised and all these things. But without a sense of purpose, they're like a skeleton walking, right? Because it seems, what is it all for? Our God-given purpose is to seek the good of others. And the more unselfish our spirit, the happier we'll be. God created us to live in love, which, as we saw, is to live to seek the good of others, not ourselves. And what has happened is that it is only the deceptions of sin that have changed our way of thinking, that have made us think that happiness is found in living for self. Now, you can find temporary happiness in living for self. Because you might say, this is not true. When I do what I want, I find happiness. But the problem is that this happiness is very temporary. And in order for it to be lasting, a person must go from one selfish pursuit to another, to another, to another. Happiness that is found in self-seeking is like a drug that provides this exhilarating feeling of, yes, I am so happy, but as soon as that goal has been obtained, a person feels empty again. Just like when after a person has experienced a rush, they then come down, and then they feel like, what is the next thing they have to do? Is they have to go again. They have to take that drug again. They have to get into that experience again. And the same thing happens with a person who seeks happiness from selfish fulfillment. They will feel that as soon as the happiness fades from this thing, they must find the next thing to satisfy their selfishness. And eventually they will just find their life going from place to place to place, chasing a temporary happiness, a temporary satisfaction, a temporary thrill. And it becomes exhausting. I want to share with you here from Steps to Christ 124. Something that I think, if you really reflect on your life, you will know this to be true. Happiness that is sought from selfish motives, outside the path of duty. I'm going to pause there. What is our God-given purpose? What is the path of duty? What is our purpose? Yeah, glorify God, but let's be more practical. To seek the good of others, right? We glorify God when we minister to others. God is a lover. God is one who serves. Jesus came to serve, not to be served. And we seek the glory of God, but it is by seeking to do good to others. So happiness that is sought from selfish motives, outside the path of duty, outside of the path of duty to serve others, it says here is ill-balanced, fitful, and transitory. What does transitory mean? Next words describe it. It passes away. The word transitory means temporary. In fact, it means very temporary, right? And the soul is filled with loneliness and sorrow. But there is joy and satisfaction in the service of God. Who here has ever had a moment of what you felt like was immense happiness, followed by a period of really terrible loneliness and sorrow? You ever had that before? Sometimes, okay, now there can be different reasons. Sometimes we can, we may actually be suffering something, a loss of a loved one, or we may, there may be other reasons. But when we're talking about seeking happiness from selfish motives, you've all heard of Monday blues, right? People seek to gratify self, when they have these 2 days of the week, they finish work on Friday, and they're like, yes, I'm ready for the weekend. Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday night. And they're thinking that they're exhilarated, they're happy, they're having a great time in whatever they're doing, okay? I'm not limiting it to anything. It can happen to us, right? We might just spend the whole weekend, just seeking one thing after another that we can please ourselves. But then what happens is Monday comes around, you don't have time anymore to devote to self-seeking because you have to work in most cases, and it follows sorrow and sadness and, sense of emptiness, right? Because of what? The happiness that's sought from selfish motives is transitory and it passes away. And I can tell you from my own experience, I remember time specifically, there was many times in my life where I would have had this experience, but I remember a time when I really began to recognize that I was not truly happy. And I remember I was in this cycle of, maybe if I could do this or go to this place or, whatever it was, or spend time with these people and have a good time and whatever it was, spend money on this, spend money on that, whatever, okay, this recreation, that, this is what, I'll feel great, I'll have happiness. But as time went by, I found this experience, transitory happiness that passed away, that was never lasting or fulfilling. And I began to question a lot of these things about, how do you just have satisfaction? How can there be some people that just seem to be happy and contented no matter what? And around that time, I began reading the book Messages to Young People by Ellen White. And I was reading this book every day. And I was reading it every day in the morning. I don't remember if I was also reading in the evenings as well, but every single day I would read some sections from the book. And I came to a part of the book, and specifically a sentence that I can tell you really changed my life in this experience that I was having. And and I'll never forget the sentence. I had to look up what page it was on, but I know it by memory, what it says. And it's here on page 55, paragraph 3. It was the first sentence here. Never will the human heart know happiness until it is submitted to be molded by the Spirit of God. Now the next sentence says, I put it there for context. This is the one that stuck in my mind. The next sentence goes on to explain that the Spirit conforms the renewed soul to the model, Jesus Christ. You know, when I came across this sentence, I just said, that's it. I realized that although I had grown up in faith, I believed the Bible was true. I believed many things. And I might have even known or subconsciously believed that, yes, following God's ways brings true happiness. But I had never really come to the point of fully submitting my heart to the working of the Holy Spirit, fully submitting my selfishness to God and to be transformed into the model Jesus Christ, with the desire and the ability to serve others. And this, for me, this was an eye-opening experience. And it was a sentence, as I said, that I will never forget. And I realized that this was an answer to prayer. And I knelt down and I asked God, I said, God, I want you to take everything. You know, there's many things, God, that I think that this would actually take away from my happiness. But I said, God, if you have to take everything from me, and it was not easy. Because, you know, you think of people like Job, and you think, what does that mean? When you tell God, take everything, and anything that you need to take it all. And think about people like Job, and you say, what does that mean? Does that mean I'm going to end up, sitting, there in the middle of useless friends and sometimes no friends like Job, sick and distressed and all that, but I said, God, I don't have a way. Why? Because I find all this temporary, passing, transitory happiness. And when I did that, it was so interesting that at the same time when I surrendered fully to God, I was just filled with this sense of peace, of contentment, and at the same time, I was just filled with a desire to help others to find the same peace, the same sense of satisfaction. And I had this desire, and I remember I would talk to people that I had talked to before, but I could just see within them that, not because I was special, but I just saw my own experience, and I understood, and I could see people that I knew, young people especially my age, and I could see that they also were not truly happy. They also were not at peace. And I remember I just had this burning desire to help them understand that how God had done wonderful things in my life, how God had given me so many things, forgiveness and strength and grace and a purpose. And I just had this burning desire to live to bless others. And it wasn't something that I forced, right? It just came because I wanted other people to experience this happiness that I had. And as we read before, the more the life is devoted to service, the more happiness it provides. And it was only when, by God's grace, I began to focus outwards on others, how I could bless others instead of myself, that I found the greatest fulfillment and happiness of my life. And, eventually it led into wanting to not only, now it didn't start, I'll tell you, I was not working in ministry at the time. It was not my full-time occupation, okay? I was actually working in another job, right? And unrelated to ministry, right? And not working for the church or anything like that. And I still was just, every day, I was just excited about looking for ways that I could, with my coworkers, with, like I said, other young adults, other young people, friends that I had, how I could be a blessing, how I could be a help, how I could be an encouragement. And it just gave me a new sense of purpose. And eventually the Lord led me into the realization that I wanted to add to that what could be done, like I said, for 30 years. Jesus could do that in Nazareth, right? I said, I want to add to that. I also want to be full-time involved in teaching and preaching and have time dedicated to continue helping and serving and blessing people, and on top of that, studying and sharing with them and bringing God's love and grace to them and helping them find happiness as well. You know, this statement is so true, the previous one that we read here. There is joy and satisfaction in the service of God. That doesn't mean that it's only a once-a-year sort of mission trip, or, once a week we do some sort of missionary work. That's all wonderful. But day by day, putting others first, this is true happiness. Psalm 128, verses 1 to 2 says, "Blessed is everyone that feareth the Lord, that walks in His ways." What are His ways? The ways of putting others first. It says, "Happy shalt thou be." In Proverbs 3, verses 13 to 18, it says, "Happy is the man that findeth wisdom, and the man that getteth understanding. For the merchandise of it is better than the merchandise of silver, and the gain thereof than fine gold. She is more precious than rubies, and all the things that thou canst desire are not to be compared unto her. Length of days is in her right hand, and in her left hand riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to them that lay hold upon her, and happy is every one that retaineth her." He's talking here about wisdom. And as you read down through Proverbs chapter 3, you come to verse 27, and it gives a practical example of what it means to have wisdom, to act in wisdom, and to have this happiness from retaining wisdom. It says, as an example, Proverbs 3, 27 to 28, "Do not withhold good from those who deserve it when it is in your power to help them." Now, who deserves to be served by our good? All. The answer to the question is exactly the same as the question that was asked of Jesus, "Who is my neighbor? Who should I help? Who should I serve?" So everybody deserves our good. It says, "Do not withhold good." This is happiness. This is wisdom. This is the way of God. Sometimes we think, find happiness in the way of God. Come and sit in your chair, sing the hymn, praise God, participate in the Sabbath school, and go home. That's the ways of God. That's happiness. That's not happiness. That alone, that's not happiness. That is called monotony, right? That is called I'm going to use a strong word, but it's used in inspiration. That is called formalism, right? If that's all that our experience is consisting of, then we're not going to find happiness. But practical ministry, this is happiness. It says, if you can help your neighbor now, do not say, "Come back tomorrow and then I'll help you." In other words, bless others as often and as frequently as it is in your power to do so. Testimonies, Volume 7, page 49 says, "Words of kindness, looks of sympathy, expressions of appreciation would to many a struggling, lonely one, be as a cup of cold water to a thirsty soul. A word of cheer, an act of kindness would go far to lighten the burdens that are resting heavily upon weary shoulders." These are some examples. And then the next sentence says, "It is in unselfish ministry that true happiness is to be found." You want to be happy? Start looking how you can bless and help and serve others. Does that mean that I need to go to a faraway place? To another country? Does that mean I even need to step out of the door of my home? I want to share with you, Steps to Christ, page 81. We need not go to heathen lands or even leave the narrow circle of the home if it is there that our duty lies in order to work for Christ. You know, the problem sometimes when you're involved in ministry is you can think, "I work for Christ, what do you do?" Right? Working for Christ can happen inside the home if it is there that our duty lies. Everybody needs to be working for Christ. Everybody needs to have Christ-like ministry, as we said, if you want to be happy. That's the only way. We can do this in the home circle, in the church, among those with whom we associate, and with those whom we do business. It doesn't matter if you're a child, a youth, an adult. It doesn't matter if you're taking care of the home, if you're a homemaker, if you have a job. It doesn't matter if you're retired, okay? Because you're retired, let me tell you, you're retired, you're still going to have people that you associate with, right? No matter what. And then in your job, the people that you do business with. This is what it means to live a life of service. We don't need to go. Sometimes the Lord may call us and say, okay, step out now. I have more for you to do. I have a place for you to be. But this is where service begins, and that's where happiness begins. And if you keep reading in the Spirit of Prophecy, you'll see that many times the reason we don't have true happiness is because we do not put these principles into practice in our homes, in our marriages, and with our families. We're loving and serving and blessing everybody else. But if it doesn't happen in the home, we're not going to find happiness. There's, as I was going through the quotes for this study, there's a whole other sermon on true happiness and how it really originates by putting into principle these practices in our marriages and in our families. Assuming we're married, right? But this is the principle that applies to all areas of our life. And so many times we want to leave the home to do ministry. I'm busy, I'm this, that, and the other. And it starts actually in the home. The joy of heaven, the joy of God, the joy of the angels, the joy of Jesus is seeing sinners come to repentance. It's serving others. Obviously, there's practical things we can do to help others, but the ultimate goal is that Jesus provided for people's earthly needs, for their practical needs, in order that He could open them up at the right time and the right place to share the gospel. Serving others is not telling them the gospel at every opportunity you get and neglecting everything else. That's not. Jesus said, if a man comes, this was actually in the book of James, right? Someone comes and you pray and say, be warmed, God bless you, and send him away, you have not served him. You've not. We think sometimes that, we just need to preach, teach, share literature. That's our duty. Okay? But remember the book of James. Service involves both. And at the same time, it's not to neglect the opportunities we have to share spiritual things, right? But very clear, go back, read the book of James. If you send him away, God bless you, be warmed, be clothed, be fed. We have not done our duty. But the ultimate goal is to have the joy of heaven, which is the joy of seeing souls saved in the kingdom. And so here, in Steps to Christ, page 79, we see that God might have committed the message of the gospel and also all the work of loving ministry, both of these things together, to the heavenly angels. He might have employed other means for accomplishing His purpose. But in His infinite love, He chose to make us co-workers with Himself, with Christ and with the angels, that we might share the blessing, the joy, the spiritual uplifting which results from this unselfish ministry. God wants us to have the joy and the blessing and the happiness that comes from serving others. And for that reason, He does not do the things for others that it's in our power to do. And more than this, again, you continue reading in the Spirit of Prophecy, and you find there the principle, which is an extension of what it says here, the spiritual uplifting, that many people who are going around saying, yeah, I'm in a slump, my spiritual life, I don't know what's going on, I'm down, I'm this and that and the other. Do you know what she says? She says many times what's lacking is get up and go and serve others. Be a blessing to others, and you'll find that you will be lifted up as you uplift others. She actually says that. She says a lot of time people are trying, what's going wrong? And this is my priority. I can't bless others because I'm in a spiritual slump. And she says, get up and go. She says, you're living to serve self. Be a blessing to others. And she says, many will be saved in working to save others. They will find out that in the end, their own souls were saved because they looked to bless and to serve and to save others. Why? Because it's impossible to live a life dedicated to serving others, not only preaching, but serving in all areas. It's impossible to live a life dedicated to serving others and at the same time be filled with selfishness. It will just destroy selfishness if day by day. And also, she says, don't wait for the impulse. Love is not a feeling. Love is not an impulse. At times you will feel like, yes, I want to do something. I want to help this person. She says, don't wait only for that. Make it a principle that you will serve and bless others. There was a Christian writer who wrote a song that had the words there talking about, what is real love? Is it just when you feel like it? And he said, Jesus didn't die for you because it was fun. He hung there in love because it had to be done. And he said, and basically the song was that love is not a feeling, it's an act of your will. It's not based on feelings. It's an act of, it's a decision that you make. I will live to bless others. With God's help, I will surrender. I will live to bless others. And in doing this, we will promote our own spiritual uplifting. We will find blessing. And most of all, what will we find there? The joy and the true happiness that God has always intended for us to have. I pray that every single person here will find that true happiness that comes from serving and loving others. It's my wish and prayer. And with God's help, amen.